6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific still felt like a Japanese lake. The rising sun flag flew over Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. American bases lay in ruins, ships rested on the harbor floor, and a stunned public was still adjusting to the reality of a long, brutal war. Yet beneath the surface of disaster, something had begun to change. The United States, once caught off guard, was mobilizing at a speed that even its own leaders had barely imagined. Shipyards hammered steel day and night, factories converted to war production, and new pilots rushed through training schools wearing fresh wings and uncertain smiles. In the Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz faced a grim ledger of losses and a simple question: how to stop an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Japan's Navy, with its veteran carrier pilots and aggressive doctrine, had struck blow after blow. But its high command also believed that America could be broken if forced into one more decisive battle, a knockout at sea that would cripple the remaining U.S. carriers and shatter American resolve. That belief drove them toward an isolated speck of coral in the Central Pacific, a place most Americans had never heard of, called Midway. For Nimitz, Midway was not just a target. It was a chance, perhaps the last one for many months, to turn surprise against the very Navy that had weaponized it at Pearl Harbor. Long before the first aircraft took off over Midway, the battle began in a cramped, windowless room in Hawaii. There, American cryptanalysts labored over columns of numbers and fragments of Japanese naval messages. They worked in shifts, surrounded by chalkboards, cigarette smoke, and endless pots of coffee. Their unofficial leader, Commander Joseph Rochefort, favored a simple robe and slippers over a formal uniform, but his mind was razor-sharp. He and his team belonged to Station Hypo, a code-breaking unit tasked with unlocking the secrets of Japan's most important naval cipher. The messages they intercepted were incomplete and heavily encrypted, but patterns emerged. References to a target called AF appeared again and again, tied to coordinates and logistics. Tokyo believed its codes were unbreakable. Hypo proved otherwise. By cross-checking water temperature reports, radio traffic, and earlier intelligence, the team suspected that AF was Midway. To confirm it, they devised a quiet trick. Midway was instructed to send an uncoded report that its desalination plant had broken down and that the island was short of fresh water. Soon after, Japanese radio traffic reported that AF was low on water. The trap had worked. With that single confirmation, Nimitz suddenly possessed an advantage almost unheard of in naval history. He knew when and where his enemy planned to strike. The Japanese thought they were setting the terms of the next battle. In reality, their plans were being read by men hunched over desks thousands of miles away, turning invisible ink into a roadmap for ambush. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, understood the stakes better than most. He knew the industrial weight of the United States and believed that Japan's only chance at victory lay in smashing the American fleet early, before U.S. shipyards could flood the Pacific with new carriers and warships. Midway, in his vision, would be the lure. By threatening this tiny outpost, he hoped to draw out the remaining American carriers and destroy them in one carefully scripted battle. It was a gambler's plan, and Yamamoto, a former student in the United States, understood just how risky it truly was. The operation he designed was breathtaking in its complexity. A main carrier force under Admiral Nagumo would strike Midway itself. Other groups would support landings, guard Japan's flank, and even threaten the Aleutian Islands near Alaska to confuse American intelligence. Dozens of ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and carriers would move across thousands of miles of ocean with clockwork precision. On paper, it was a masterpiece of naval choreography, designed to overwhelm any opponent who stumbled into its path. But the same complexity hid deadly weaknesses. The Japanese fleet was spread out over a vast area, its forces divided by distance and communications delays. Confidence, bordering on overconfidence, led planners to assume that American carriers would be surprised and outmatched. They did not seriously consider the possibility that their own movements were being watched, their timetables anticipated. Yamamoto's grand design depended on secrecy and initiative. Unknown to him, both had already slipped away. On the small atoll of Midway, the impending storm was no secret. Thanks to the codebreakers, Nimitz ordered defenses strengthened and airfields reinforced. Engineers worked furiously to expand runways, dig shelters, and emplace more anti-aircraft guns along the sandy perimeter. Pilots arrived in a steady stream, flying marine fighters and bombers that were older and slower than many of Japan's frontline aircraft. They knew they were outgunned, but they also knew something the Japanese did not. Midway was not alone. Far out at sea, Nimitz positioned his last precious carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, east of the atoll, beyond the expected Japanese search arcs. Their decks became floating hives of activity. Ground crews checked engines and rearmed aircraft, pilots reviewed recognition charts and attack plans, and briefing rooms buzzed with whispered questions. No one knew exactly how many enemy carriers they would face. But they did know one critical fact. Japan was coming, and this time, the Americans would not be the ones surprised. On the island itself, Marines dug foxholes among scrub and coral, while Navy personnel calibrated rangefinders and radar operators monitored their glowing screens with a mix of curiosity and dread. Midway had little strategic value in peacetime. Now it was about to become the focal point of a struggle that would decide who held the initiative in the Pacific. Every man on that atoll understood that they were standing on the front line of history. Shortly after dawn on June 4th, 1942, lookouts on Midway spotted dots on the horizon that quickly grew into formations of incoming aircraft. Japanese bombers and fighters launched from Nagumo's carriers roared toward the atoll in tight groups. Sirens wailed, men scrambled to battle stations, and anti-aircraft crews swung their guns skyward. The air raid that followed was ferocious. Explosions ripped into fuel tanks and buildings, craters opened along the runways, and black smoke climbed into the pale morning sky. Yet under the chaos, Midway's defenses held. The island was bloodied, but not silenced. Even as Japanese pilots turned back toward their carriers, believing they had largely neutralized the airfield, another drama was unfolding over the open ocean. From Midway and from the American carriers hidden to the east, waves of U.S. aircraft clawed into the air. Many were outdated torpedo bombers and dive bombers, slow and vulnerable compared to Japan's elite fighters. Pilots flew long, exhausting stretches over empty sea, searching for a fleet that could be anywhere within hundreds of miles. Navigation errors, mechanical failures, and sheer fatigue claimed aircraft before they ever saw an enemy ship. But the attacks, however scattered, had a crucial effect. As morning progressed, Nagumo's flight decks became the most dangerous real estate in the Pacific. His crews struggled to recover returning aircraft while simultaneously rearming others for a second strike. this time aimed at the American carriers they now suspected were nearby. Bombs and torpedoes were loaded, unloaded, and swapped below decks, as orders changed in response to new reports. On those crowded hangar decks, fuel lines snaked across the floor, munitions lay stacked and waiting, and the Japanese carrier force shifted, moment by moment, from predator to exposed target, without yet realizing how thin the margin of safety had become. By mid-morning on June 4th, the search for the Japanese fleet turned desperate. American carrier commanders could not wait forever. Every hour gave the enemy more time to strike first. When contacts finally came in, vague, incomplete, but enough, orders were given to launch. Among the first to go were the torpedo squadrons, flying outdated, underpowered TBD Devastators. Their crews knew the odds. They had trained for low-altitude approaches that brought them directly into the teeth of enemy fire, and many had heard whispers of how unreliable their torpedoes could be. Still, when the signal came, they throttled up and rolled down the decks. Over the open Pacific, the torpedo planes flew low, skimming the waves in tight formations. They had little fighter cover, their speed barely higher than that of the ships they hunted. As they closed in on Nagumo's carriers, alarms sounded across the Japanese task force. Fighters of the elite combat air patrol dove to intercept. What followed was slaughter. Devastators were picked off one by one, ripped apart by cannon and machine gun fire, or smashed into the sea by flak bursts. Pilots nursed crippled aircraft toward impossible attack runs, dropping torpedoes amid curtains of water and steel. Almost none of these early torpedo attacks scored a hit. Squadrons were reduced to a handful of survivors, or none at all. Yet in dying they achieved something no one on those decks could fully see. They dragged Japanese fighters down to sea level, pulled them out of position, and forced the carriers to keep twisting and turning at high speed. Deck crews could not safely launch or recover new waves of planes. High above the melee, the sky was clearing for a different kind of attack. While torpedo squadrons bled at wavetop height, another group of American aircraft fought its own battle against uncertainty, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers. Launched from Enterprise and Yorktown, many of these flights initially missed their rendezvous points or searched empty ocean where the Japanese fleet was supposed to be. Fuel gauges slipped lower. Pilots traded worried glances, and navigators recalculated headings by dead reckoning and scattered reports. The mission teetered on the brink of failure. A decision had to be made: turn back to the carriers and abandon the hunt, or push deeper into the unknown. Then, chance intervened. One group spotted a lone Japanese ship, a destroyer, racing at high speed, trailing a white wake across the blue. Its course suggested it was hurrying to rejoin the main fleet. The Americans followed. Minutes later, as they climbed toward attack altitude, the clouds parted and the Pacific opened up to reveal a sight that would etch itself into history. 4 Japanese carriers, flight decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, turning into the wind, with most of their fighters dragged down low by earlier attacks. From their vantage point, the dauntless pilots saw chaos, ships maneuvering wildly, anti-aircraft guns beginning to bark, columns of smoke rising from earlier engagements. But they also saw opportunity. In that fleeting window, the battlefield tilted. While torpedo bombers had been torn apart in the lower sky, they had unwittingly set the stage for the dive bombers now rolling into their steep, screaming dives. The attack that followed lasted only a handful of minutes, but it broke the back of Japan's carrier force. At approximately 10:22 a.m., Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown pitched into near-vertical dives, canopies rattling, windscreens streaked with oil and condensation. Below them, the carriers Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu frantically tried to evade. On their decks lay rows of aircraft being refueled and rearmed, bomb racks open, torpedoes and bombs stacked nearby. Fuel hoses snaked across the planks. It was the worst possible moment to be caught. Pilots focused on their targets, ignoring the tracers clawing upward. They throttled back, extended dive brakes, and aimed for the thin rectangles of deck amid the flak. Bombs tumbled free, falling for seconds that felt like hours. Then, one by one, they struck. Great blossoms of fire erupted along the flight decks, tearing open hangars below. Fuel ignited, munitions cooked off in vicious secondary explosions, and sheets of flame rolled through the confined spaces where aircraft and crews had been preparing the next strike. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were transformed from instruments of power into burning wrecks, their decks shattered, their crews fighting for survival instead of victory. Fires raged out of control. Twisted aircraft and debris littered the ruins of once pristine flight decks. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, remained operational for the moment, but the balance had shifted irrevocably. In the span of a single attack, Japan lost the core of the striking force that had carried it from Pearl Harbor to the edge of dominance. The Japanese Navy was wounded, but not yet finished. Aboard Hiryu, officers moved quickly to salvage what they could from disaster. While smoke from the stricken carriers curled into the sky, Hiryu's flight deck crews rushed to launch counterstrikes against the American carriers they now knew must be nearby. Pilots who had survived earlier sorties climbed back into cockpits, engines roared to life, and fresh waves of bombers and fighters clawed into the air, fueled by shock and fury. Their first counterattack found Yorktown. Emerging from the clouds, Japanese aircraft dove through flak and fighter opposition to drop bombs squarely onto her decks. Explosions rocked the ship, starting fires and temporarily halting flight operations. Damage control teams scrambled through choking smoke, dragging hoses and closing hatches, while wounded men were carried to aid stations. Yet Yorktown refused to die. Within hours, her crew had patched holes, restored some power, and even resumed launching planes. To distant observers, she looked like a different carrier entirely. A second strike came, this time armed with torpedoes. Japanese torpedo bombers pressed home their attack with grim determination. This time, their weapons slammed into Yorktown's side, tearing open her hull and knocking out power. The carrier listed sharply, dead in the water. Orders were eventually given to abandon ship. As sailors slid down lines into the sea, watching the vessel that had carried them from the Atlantic into the Pacific War, they believed they were witnessing the loss of one of America's last shields. What they did not know was that, even as Yorktown faltered, other American aircraft were already hunting Hiryu herself. As the afternoon wore on, American scouts finally located Hiryu, still operating alone amid the drifting wrecks of her sister carriers. The ship's crew worked feverishly to recover damaged planes, arm new sorties, and maintain some semblance of offensive power. To Japanese officers, the situation was desperate, but not yet hopeless. If they could cripple another American carrier, perhaps the balance might still be redrawn. But the window was closing fast. Dauntless dive bombers, redirected from their searches, closed in for another attack. Unlike the chaotic first strike, this time the target was singular and clearly defined. Hiryu maneuvered at high speed, twisting through the waves as her anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with dark puffs. Fighters rose to meet the attackers, but numbers and altitude favored the Americans. Once again, the dauntless pilots rolled into their dives, one after another, lining up the long, narrow deck in their sights. Bombs slammed into Hiryu's flight deck and superstructure, punching through into hangars below. Flames erupted, fed by fuel and ammunition still aboard. The carrier staggered, trailing thick smoke. Efforts to control the fires failed as explosions ripped through internal compartments. By evening, Hiryu was a dying ship, her crew fighting not for victory, but for the chance to abandon her with some measure of order. Scuttling charges and torpedoes would eventually send her beneath the waves. With her loss, the last pillar of Japan's Midway strike force collapsed, leaving the once dominant carrier arm shattered in a single day. As the sun slipped toward the horizon on June 4th, the Pacific around Midway no longer looked like an arena of precision maneuvers. It was a graveyard in the making. Columns of smoke marked where great ships had burned. Debris drifted across the swells, splintered wood, bits of wreckage, the occasional life raft rising and falling on the waves. Overhead, the frantic tempo of air combat slowed. Pilots with nearly empty fuel tanks raced back toward their carriers or toward Midway's fragile runways, some landing on fumes, others never making it home at all. On the American side, damage reports crackled across radios. Yorktown, once the workhorse of the fleet, lay crippled, her hull torn open, listing and motionless. Destroyers edged close to take on survivors, engines humming as boats shuttled men from the carrier's side. For many sailors, the day's chaos was only now catching up to them, numbness giving way to exhaustion, adrenaline fading into the dull ache of loss. They had seen comrades vanish in explosions, aircraft fail to return, and ships they knew by name transformed into burning silhouettes. Yet amid the wreckage, there was also a sense of stunned realization. They had done something enormous. Reports filtered back that not one, not two, but 4 Japanese carriers had been hit, 3 already confirmed as burning wrecks, the 4th heavily damaged. No one yet understood the full scale of the victory, but every officer and enlisted man sensed that the tide, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, had begun to turn. For Japan's vaunted carrier force, the Codebreaking, Midway was more than a tactical setback. It was a spiritual and strategic catastrophe. In the days and nights that followed, surviving ships shepherded crippled vessels, and rescue operations scoured the waters for men cast adrift. Hundreds of sailors and aircrew were never found. Those who were pulled from the sea, shivering and oil-stained, spoke in fragmented sentences about sudden explosions, burning decks, and comrades swallowed by fire or water in seconds. The loss of 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, struck at the very heart of Japanese naval power. Each ship had carried not just aircraft, but precious veteran pilots and deck crews whose experience could not be easily replaced. Japan's pre-war training program had produced an elite cadre of aviators, hardened in China and the opening months of the Pacific War. At Midway, a large portion of that corps vanished in a single campaign. New pilots could be trained, but they would lack the seasoning and instincts that came only from years of combat. Official communiques softened the blow, framing the engagement as a hard-fought action against a powerful foe. But inside naval headquarters, the mood was grim and quiet. The commanders understood what the casualty lists and ship losses meant. Japan had thrown its best punch and missed. From that moment on, every operation in the Pacific would be launched with fewer carriers, fewer veteran pilots, and a growing awareness that the balance of power was slipping away. For the United States, Midway was more than a line on a campaign map. It was a psychological turning point. Just months earlier, Americans had watched their battleships sink in the muddy waters of Pearl Harbor. Newspapers carried headlines of retreat and surrender across the Pacific. Now, those same papers showed maps with arrows pointing in a new direction, accompanied by cautiously triumphant headlines. Japanese carriers sunk, American forces victorious. The story of how it had been done, codebreakers, daring bomber crews, and the narrowest of chances, was still largely hidden, but the result was undeniable. In the wardrooms and ready rooms of the Pacific Fleet, the effect was immediate. Pilots and sailors who had once felt they were brawling uphill against a stronger foe now knew they could win. They had stood against Japan's finest carriers and not only survived, but crippled them. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Japanese Navy since Pearl Harbor began to fade. It did not erase the dangers ahead. Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and countless island battles still loomed, but it changed how those dangers were faced. In Washington, Midway strengthened arguments for a more aggressive strategy in the Pacific. Production schedules were accelerated, new carriers pushed toward completion, and long-range plans for an island-hopping campaign took on new urgency. The United States had been fighting to stop Japan's advance. After Midway, it began to plan quietly but firmly for how to roll that advance back. In the months and years that followed, the Battle of Midway quickly took on a near-mythic status. For many Americans, it became the story of an outnumbered force snatching victory from the jaws of defeat, a counterpart to earlier, darker tales of surprise and disaster. Images of dive bombers plunging onto enemy carriers, of sailors clinging to life rafts, and of burning ships slipping beneath the waves became part of the war's visual memory. Midway was retold in newsreels, radio broadcasts, and later in books and films, each adding its own layer of drama and symbolism. Yet much of what made the victory possible remained hidden behind a veil of secrecy. The work of the codebreakers at Station Hypo, whose painstaking efforts had allowed Nimitz to set his ambush, was classified. Their story, and the quiet brilliance of the trick that confirmed Midway as AF, would not be widely known until long after the war. To the public, Midway seemed like a miracle of courage and luck. Inside the intelligence community, it was also a triumph of analysis and patience. On the Japanese side, Midway entered legend in a different way. It became a symbol of a turning point where fortune deserted the empire, the moment when boldness and complex planning were undone by miscalculation and underestimation of the enemy. Officers and historians would argue for decades about what had gone wrong. Was it faulty doctrine, scattered forces, hubris, or simply fate? In those debates, Midway stood not just as a defeat, but as a warning. Looking back, historians would call Midway the turning point in the Pacific War, not because it ended the conflict, but because it shifted its momentum. Before Midway, Japan moved forward, choosing when and where to strike, expanding an empire across oceans and archipelagos. After Midway, that forward motion slowed, then stalled. Never again would Japan launch a major offensive with the same carrier strength and confidence. The initiative began to pass, slowly but steadily, to the United States. The victory did not spare America from the brutal, grinding battles still to come. Guadalcanal, the Solomons, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, each would demand terrible sacrifices. But at Midway, the balance of naval power began to bend in a new direction. American shipyards poured out new carriers faster than Japan could hope to match. Fresh pilots graduated from training in waves, supported by an industrial base that dwarfed anything in the Axis world. The Pacific, once dominated by the rising sun, became a theater where American task forces could move with growing strength and reach. For the men who fought there, Midway was not an abstract turning point. It was a day of fear, confusion, courage, and loss. A day when torpedo pilots flew into near-certain death, when dive-bomber crews seized a fleeting chance, and when thousands of individual decisions combined into a single, decisive outcome. In the story of World War II, Midway stands as the moment when the Pacific stopped being a road of Japanese victories and became, instead, the long path toward Allied return and eventual triumph.